Welcome to Autonomous Conversations, the podcast leading up to the Governor Symposium 2025. 15 years of constitutional autonomy, achievements, lessons, and prospects. Today's topic is a country within a kingdom. Our goal is to inform, educate the public about Sint Maarten's constitutional history, its current status, and its prospects for the future. In today's episode, we're excited to welcome Professor Gerhard Hoogers, a constitutional and administrative law scholar specializing in constitutional theory, comparative law, and the constitutional relations within the Kingdom of the Netherlands. Professor Hoogers, welcome.
Thank you.
We'll dive right into it. Let's talk about our separate status. What did the separate status mean in context of the 2000 referendum? I'm more referring to the legal and the constitutional implications.
Yes. Well, when Sint Maarten held its referendum in 2000, it was actually the referendum that started the final dissolution of the Netherlands Antilles. In that sense, Sint Maarten is guilty of dissolving the Netherlands Antilles in some way. And the topic under discussion then was whether Sint Maarten should stay within the Netherlands Antilles. That was one option. Whether it should become independent or whether it should have a separate country status. And that last option got, as we know, in the referendum, the most support from the population. I think it was 53% or so of the entire result of the referendum. And of course, the example Sint Maarten was looking at back then was basically Aruba. Because Aruba had shown that A, you could leave the Netherlands Antilles, which they had done in 1986, and B, that you could do that by getting basically the same status that the Netherlands Antilles had always since 1954. So that was the model that Sint Maarten was looking at and that the majority of the voters, or if you will, the population, preferred in the referendum. Well, first of all, you have to say the Netherlands was very much not enthusiastic about this referendum and about the results of it, because back then The Hague still believed that the Netherlands Antilles should stay together. That was the idea. And only after the referendums on the other islands, and they had made clear that basically only Sint Eustatius wanted to remain within the Netherlands Antilles, and well, you can't have a Netherlands Antilles composed of just Sint Eustatius. So, that made clear that the Netherlands Antilles had no political and social viable future. Only then, after The Hague accepted that the demise of the Netherlands Antilles was inevitable, then of course the thoughts had to start, what then? How then is this country status for Sint Maarten and for Curaçao going to be achieved? And the Netherlands very heavily put a lot of effort into maintaining as much ties as possible. And one of the big differences, of course, was that, well, first of all, Sint Maarten and Curaçao, of course, too, was not able to access full financial autonomy. Aruba got its own currency in 1986 and its own central bank. Sint Maarten did not, and Curaçao did not either. So now we have the Caribbean guilder, as we all know. Second of all, Sint Maarten did not get its own public ministry. Sint Maarten, Aruba did get its own public ministry in 1986 with its own procureur-generaal. I don't really know the English term for procureur-generaal, but its own head of the public ministry. Whereas Sint Maarten was sort of forced together with Curaçao to remain within one public ministry organization. And of course, Sint Maarten did not get its own judicial system, its own judicial, its own courts. But you have to say, Aruba had not gotten that either. So also when Aruba got out of the Netherlands Antilles, the judicial organization maintained a supra-country organization, if you will. So together, Aruba and the Netherlands Antilles maintained a unified judicial system. And of course, after the dissolution of the Netherlands Antilles, that idea was maintained for all the 6 islands.
Okay. So in what areas did Sint Maarten obtain its full autonomy?
Well, basically in those areas that the Charter grants full autonomy to the countries, which is the Charter of the Kingdom in 1954 divided powers, if you will, between the Kingdom on the one hand and the countries on the other hand. And the kingdom has quite limited powers. The kingdom basically does foreign affairs, defense, the common nationality that we have. We're all Dutch citizens. We have the same passport. And a few other rather minor things that there is. And there is one coat of arms for the kingdom. Well, that's also laid down in the charter, but it's not really that exciting. And all other matters are basically autonomous country matters. So everything that is not defense, foreign affairs, nationality, and 3 or 4 other things is a country and therefore an autonomous Sint Maarten affair, in theory.
You've written extensively on the constitutional and kingdom affairs. How does the relationship between Sint Maarten and the kingdom actually work in practice?
Yeah, that's the catch, of course. I did not end by in theory for nothing, because that's the reality on paper. But you might remember that a few minutes ago I said that The Hague was not that enthusiastic about Sint Maarten becoming a separate country. And that lack of enthusiasm has sort of seeped through into practical organization of the kingdom too. For Curaçao as well, but especially for Sint Maarten, The Hague, to put it rudely, did not quite believe that Sint Maarten was up to the task. So a samenwerkingsregeling, it's quite hard to translate that into English, but a common regulation between the Netherlands and Sint Maarten was made that sort of prescribed that Sint Maarten would need a lot of assistance in setting itself up as an autonomous country for the years to come. And on quite a few other areas, there were also created samenwerkingsregelingen, or the Netherlands sort of forced Sint Maarten to accept certain things. A very common example, of course, is the integrity chamber. The Netherlands sort of pushed it through Sint Maarten's throat that it should have an integrity chamber, and threatened, sanctions if that was not done. So there are quite a few examples where officially Sint Maarten has autonomy, but then Big Brother Holland comes around the corner, put his broad arm around Sint Maarten's shoulder and said, "Let's walk together over this bridge, shall we?" And Sint Maarten is sort of forced to accept that big broad arm around its shoulder and walk on that bridge together, even if maybe deep down inside Sint Maarten would want to go a separate direction, but that's not always possible because, well, as everybody knows, the people who pay the bills got to have a lot of say, and as long as Sint Maarten remains financially also dependent upon the Netherlands, it's very hard to sort of exercise that autonomy fully. So yeah, you can say that in practice Sint Maarten is not as autonomous as you might suggest from just reading the text of the Charter of the Kingdom and thinking, oh, okay, well, cool. Sint Maarten has full financial autonomy, full cultural autonomy, full monetary autonomy. That's all not the case in reality. Of course, on the other end, you can argue, is that such a bad thing? I mean, Sint Maarten is small, and you can argue that small countries can benefit from still remaining part of a bigger, a bigger whole, such as the kingdom. So, but that's, of course, that's in the end a political discussion. It's not a legal matter per se. But you can take from this that Sint Maarten is, practically speaking, less autonomous than it would appear on paper.
Okay, having said all that, what laws or what is there that either Sint Maarten could do internationally or within the kingdom that our political constitutional situation can develop in the future or change into something different?
Mm-hmm. Well, under international law, it's actually not that complicated. Sint Maarten has a right to self-determination under international law. It used to be a colony. Former colonies have the right to, in the end, full self-determination. And the kingdom has always acknowledged that. So if Sint Maarten would want to opt for full independence, it could. It has entirely entitled to do that. If that is a wise decision, again, is something else. But legally speaking, that's not a problem. Changing the status of Sint Maarten within the kingdom is more complicated. It's theoretically possible, but it would, for instance, entail amending the charter. Now, that is possible too. We did it in 2010 when the Netherlands Antilles were dissolved. But it would you would need the cooperation of all kingdom partners, because you can only amend the charter if all 4 kingdom partners are in full agreement on that. So Sint Maarten would need the support of Curaçao, Aruba, and the Netherlands to be able to do that. But it's, I mean, you could, for instance, think of a status that that is like the Cook Islands have with New Zealand. I won't go into the details, but that is a relationship where the Cook Islands are almost entirely independent, but still share some common structures with New Zealand. That is theoretically a possible scenario. Or you could look at what France and New Caledonia have agreed recently, where New Caledonia not only gains more autonomy within the French Republic, but quite interesting, New Caledonia gains its own nationality, which does not replace French nationality, which will be put alongside it. Yeah. I mean, Sint Maarten, theoretically, you could discuss why not think of a Sint Maarten nationality that is coexistent with Dutch nationality, for instance. But in order to do that, you would have to amend the charter, because the charter now says that we only have one common nationality, which is the Dutch nationality. So, I mean, theoretically speaking, you know, with your feet upon the table and just gazing at the skies and drinking a beer, you could come up with multiple scenarios of what might be possible. But the bottom line of it all is you would need to amend the charter to do that. And you therefore would need the full cooperation of the other kingdom partners.
That's a mouthful. There's a lot, and I know we've delved somewhat into it, and we will need much more time to continue. But I want to thank you for giving us an insight and helping us to better understand our legal and constitutional dimensions that we have which pertains to our autonomy. I want to thank you so much for your time and for making us so much more wiser for the information that you've just transferred to us.
The pleasure was all mine. Thank you.
This has been another episode of Autonomous Conversations, the podcast leading up to the Governor's Symposium 2025. Please join us next week when we turn the microphone over to you, where you'll be given an opportunity to tell us how you feel about our current status and the future of Sint Maarten.